There are stories so frequently retold that they seep into our collective subconscious until we believe we have mastered every detail and felt every intended emotion. Yet, how many of us have truly paused in a moment of absolute stillness to contemplate the visceral harshness, the heartbreaking, unvarnished reality of that winter night in Bethlehem? There were no dazzling stage lights, no celestial spotlights, and certainly no angelic choirs echoing through a shimmering sky like the romanticized oil paintings of later centuries suggest. The truth was far more abrasive, a bone-chilling, skin-piercing cold settling over a limestone mountain town packed beyond its capacity. Streets that were narrow by design became suffocating, choked by throngs of people and swirling clouds of grit. Exhausted families, buckled under the weight of a harsh Roman census decree, had been forced to abandon their familiar hearths to return to ancestral lands. Amidst this chaotic uncertainty, a young couple stood on the precipice of parenthood, unable to find even a modest place to rest. It was within this specific context, one defined by poverty, insecurity, and profound inconvenience, that a baby's first cry broke the silence. This tiny event, seemingly beneath the world's notice, would quietly yet irrevocably alter the very course of human history. What has allowed this story to endure for millennia is not a beginning marked by imperial glory, but rather its roots in a state of destitution and vulnerability that any human being can recognize, touch, and grieve for. Perhaps the more slowly we listen and the more closely we look, the more we realize this is not merely a tale of an ancient winter night, but a profound lesson in how history pivots in the most unexpected ways, often while ordinary people are simply struggling to survive one more night. On that night in Bethlehem, not a single soul could have guessed what was about to unfold within a frigid limestone cave. The merchant, closing his stall with limbs aching from a day of frantic haggling, thought only of the warmth of his own bed. He did not know the local family, who had begrudgingly yielded their cramped courtyard to a group of weary strangers from Galilee, felt only the irritation of the crowd. They did not know. Even the Roman soldier on guard, his eyes glazed with boredom as he watched the turbulent masses through the biting frost, had not the slightest suspicion. To them, it was merely an overcrowded, stifling and miserable night, burdened by a census decree that no one had asked for. Yet, in that seemingly mundane and tedious darkness, amidst a town gasping for air, an event began. It was so small it was almost invisible, yet powerful enough to shatter the old world and forge a new one. The haunting power of this story, which has gripped the human heart for 2,000 years, lies not in the golden glow of a royal court, but in the gritty, weary, and cold reality of everyday life. Bethlehem was never a grand, sprawling metropolis. It was a humble, unpretentious town, perched upon a narrow limestone ridge, some 800 meters above sea level, and about 8 kilometers south of Jerusalem. In ordinary times, it housed perhaps 1,000 or 1,200 residents who lived simple lives dictated by the stone and the soil. Houses clung to the spine of the ridge, huddled together as they tumbled down the eastern slopes. The alleys were so narrow that if two laden donkeys met, one would have to retreat to allow the other passage. The air was thick with the scent of flickering wood fires, the familiar pungency of olive oil, and the ever-present musk of livestock. The cold here was no metaphor. It was a physical weight. Winter in Bethlehem is high enough for frost to blanket the ground, and the winds sweeping off the Judean hills carry a chill that cuts like a blade. Had you been there on that fateful night, you would have pulled your heavy woolen cloak tight, seeking warmth from your neighbor or any heat source available. Torches on the main thoroughfare flickered violently against the wind, producing more smoke than light, casting long, distorted shadows of trudging figures. And amidst this small, gritty, and unremarkable scene, something incomprehensibly vast was beginning without a sound, without a herald. What strikes me most are the surrounding people. They were not mere cardboard cutouts or background extras in a historical play. They were real human beings, frayed by exhaustion, snapping at one another in their frantic search for a bed or a scrap of food, trying to manage in a town whose population had suddenly quadrupled. The Roman Empire, in its absolute sovereignty, had issued its command, and that dry administrative order had dragged every Jewish family back to their ancestral roots. They returned to places they had long since left, to towns too small to hold them. The sheer commonness and the frustration of these circumstances are precisely what make the story so moving. History does not always change in gilded palaces or the corridors of power. Often, it shifts in the middle of a tired, shoving crowd, amongst people who only want a quiet place to lay their heads for the night. The northern entrance to Bethlehem descends from the direction of Jerusalem. It was a rugged limestone path, unpaved and treacherous, wide enough for a cart in some places, but narrowing to a single-file track in others. Anyone who had walked those 8 kilometers would remember every jagged stone and every heavy step. While the usual population was small, that night it may have swelled to 4,000 or more. The logistics of a Roman census were terrifyingly efficient. Every family with ties to the House of David was required to report to Bethlehem. Over generations, that lineage had spread far and wide, and that evening, a sea of people converged on a single, tiny mountain ridge, creating an unprecedented crisis of space. In practical terms, this was a disaster. The meager springs of fresh water were not designed for such numbers. Food reserves dwindled, and sleeping space vanished entirely. Bethlehem's homes were simple affairs, often single-story structures built into the hillside. The lower levels were frequently hewn directly into the natural limestone, providing a space that was cooler in summer and warmer in winter. At night, animals, donkeys, oxen, goats were brought into the lower part of the house. They weren't kept in a distant, separate barn, but were integrated into the living space, separated only by a low stone wall or a simple step. By the standards of the time, this wasn't a sign of extreme poverty. It was the standard architecture of the masses. The body heat from the livestock served as a primitive yet effective heating system during the bitter winter nights. It is worth noting that these spaces, natural caves or chambers carved into the rock for storage, and animals were ubiquitous in Bethlehem. The limestone is soft enough to be excavated easily, allowing families to expand their dwellings over generations. The majestic Church of the Nativity was eventually built over a complex of such caves that had been venerated since the earliest times. While we cannot say with absolute certainty which specific cave it was, the setting itself, a shelter for animals adjacent to a family home, is historically flawless. It is not a legendary detail added for theological flourish. It was a gritty, commonplace reality. It is this very lack of glamour that allows the story to touch the human soul so deeply. On the main street, the night market was compressed, its stalls shrinking to accommodate the human tide. A few lingering vendors sat hunched over their wares, hoping for one last sale. The smell of roasted meat occasionally drifted through the air, mingling with the scent of wet wool, livestock, and dust. A woman waited patiently by the well for her turn to fill a heavy clay jar. The crowd was predominantly Jewish, many from the prestigious line of David, arriving from Judea or as far as southern Galilee. Some had walked for hours, others for days. If Joseph and Mary had indeed traveled from Galilee, the journey would have covered between 80 and 100 kilometers. That is 3 to 5 days of continuous walking, likely longer for a heavily pregnant woman or a slow-moving caravan. It was the month of Kislev or Tevet, roughly November to January. Though not the dead of winter, it was cold enough that a night on a limestone mountain would test the limits of human endurance. The people in that crowd wore tunics of undyed wool or coarse linen. Over these, they draped heavy cloaks that functioned as both coats and blankets. Simple leather sandals protected calloused feet, and headcloths were wrapped tight against the chill. Women wore similar layers, practical and modest. Children looked like miniature versions of their parents, their clothes often frayed and worn. The fabrics were rough, far removed from the soft, flowing robes we imagine. Only the wealthy could afford dyed cloth. Most of the people on the street that night were poor, carrying only the essentials: heavy goatskin water bottles, dry rations, small oil lamps, and thin sleeping mats. Those with a donkey were the lucky ones. The rest bore their entire lives on their shoulders. What is most striking is how a Roman census created a strange equality in discomfort. The empire did not care if you were a respected village elder or a young carpenter from a backwater hamlet. If your lineage led to Bethlehem, you were forced to be there, jostling in the mud, searching for a corner to sleep in like everyone else. Even the locals were overwhelmed. Some opened their courtyards to distant kin, others cleared roofs or storage rooms. In the ancient Near East, hospitality was both a sacred communal duty and a survival mechanism. Today, you help a stranger. Tomorrow, you may be the stranger in need. Thus, the famous detail that there was no room in the inn is better understood in its actual context. There was no room in the Times Katalima, the guest room of a private home. This Greek term suggests a guest chamber rather than a commercial hotel. When the guest room was full, the family Joseph and Mary was directed to the lower level where the animals were kept, either a cave or an attached stone room. That was it. No mythology is required to make it poignant. The sheer, stark reality of the arrangement is what makes it so heartbreakingly authentic. Behind this chaotic, everyday struggle loomed the undeniable shadow of the Roman Empire. Augustus, formerly Octavian, the first emperor of Rome, was the most powerful man in the Western world. His empire spanned continents, ruling tens of millions with an administrative machine that was as efficient as it was ruthless. A census was a primary tool of control used to register the populace for taxation and military monitoring. The term used in the Gospel of Luke describes exactly this type of registration. Rome wanted to know exactly whom it ruled, what it could take from them, and how to keep them under its thumb. Then there was Herod the Great, the client king of Judea. He was a man of extraordinary architectural genius, but also one consumed by paranoia and a cruelty that bordered on the pathological. He was a man who would execute his own sons if he suspected a coup. The people of Judea lived under a double burden, the local tyranny of Herod and the global shadow of Rome. Taxes flowed in both directions, eroding the stability of every household. A Jewish family might face land taxes, crop taxes, poll taxes, and road tolls. In a good year, the burden was heavy. In a bad year, it was a death sentence. Many lived on the razor's edge of subsistence. One failed harvest could lead to irreversible debt. Yet, they still had to travel to register, because defying the empire was not an option for ordinary people without armies or influence. This is the true face of power. Not always spectacular violence, but a quiet, persistent administrative pressure that suffocates the life out of a family. In the midst of this imperial machinery and the harshness of the elements, a child was born in a cold cave on the eastern slopes of Bethlehem. We cannot know the exact day or month. Even the year is debated, though most scholars place it between 6 and 4 BC, based on the death of Herod. But what we can reconstruct with startling clarity is the world that greeted this event, and it is the very ordinariness of that harsh world that gives the event its weight. It requires no embellishment to be profound. Childbirth in 1st century Judea was a life or death struggle. There were no sterile hospitals, no modern medicine, no comforts we take for granted. Maternal mortality was a constant shadow, and infant loss in the first week was a common lingering grief. To give birth in the cold, away from one's own home and the supportive network of female relatives, was a terrifying prospect. Yet, paradoxically, this was not uncommon in the ancient world. Most women gave birth wherever they happened to be, with whatever resources were at hand. This is why the detail of the manger is so devastatingly real. A manger is not a poetic prop. It is a functional object, usually carved from stone or rough wood, used to hold animal fodder. When there was no cradle and nothing better was available, it became the only place to put the child. It was a moment of desperate, improvised survival, the kind of improvisation forced upon people who are pushed to the very edge. Outside the cave, the night continued as it always had. A dog barked in the distance, its voice lonely in the cold air. The rhythmic clatter of a pulley system at a cistern echoed through the dark, a reminder of the unending cycle of daily chores. A child cried in a crowded house nearby. A Roman soldier shifted his weight to ease his aching feet, staring blankly at the clouds. The merchants were deep in an exhausted sleep. No one outside that cave knew what had happened. No one realized that history had just turned a page right next to them. This is the part that moves me most. The greatest pivots of history, the most revolutionary shifts, often arrive without the beating of drums or the shouting of crowds. They arrive in the middle of the weary, cluttered lives of anonymous people. And yet, within a single generation, the story of that night would be told from Jerusalem to Rome, from tiny hamlets to the great hubs of civilization. Within a few centuries, the faith that began in that moment would become the official religion of the very empire that had forced that family onto the road. It is a staggering historical irony, a testament to the unstoppable power of a humble beginning. If you had looked at the sky over Bethlehem that winter night, you would have seen more stars than any modern city dweller can imagine. The Judean sky was clear enough to see the Milky Way like a silver ribbon draped across the heavens. The ancients lived close to the rhythms of nature and the mysteries of the cosmos. Whether the wise men from the East were astronomers or mystics is a matter of perspective, but one thing is certain: they looked up far more than we do. They contemplated the vastness of the universe, whereas we often look down at our screens and our fleeting material concerns, forgetting the deeper, wider layers of meaning that define our existence and the universe itself. Today, Bethlehem has grown into a city of some 30,000 souls, nestled within a landscape defined by geopolitical complexity and enduring strife. It remains a focal point for long-standing tensions, yet at its heart, the Church of the Nativity stands with a quiet, unwavering majesty. Having endured through successive ages, it is the oldest continuously operating Christian church in the world, a profound testament to the resilience of faith. Its ancient stonework, exquisitely carved pillars, and shimmering mosaics, alongside the sacred grottos beneath the altar, serve as a reminder of an unbroken continuity. This narrative thread has wound its way through wars, the rise and fall of empires, utter devastation, and subsequent restoration. There is a story that when Persian forces swept through the region in 614 AD, razed other sanctuaries to the ground, they spared this particular structure. It is said they were moved by a wall mosaic depicting the Magi dressed in traditional Persian attire. History, it seems, can be redirected by the strangest, most human of details moments that appear incidental yet carry an unfathomable depth of meaning. What lingers with me after much contemplation is the stark, almost jarring disparity between the monumental scale of Rome and the humble obscurity of Bethlehem. On one side stood a colossal empire of millions, boasting elite legions, fortified roads, rigid laws, and a ruthless taxation system, an empire of polished marble and absolute authority. On the other, a small limestone ridge, a town overflowing with travelers, and a family forced to seek refuge amongst livestock in a rudimentary manger. Yet, Rome has long since crumbled, leaving behind only the magnificent ruins of a golden age. Meanwhile, that which began in the humble, biting chill of a Bethlehem night endures, remaining a cornerstone of the human experience. It persists not merely as a religious conviction for billions, but as a moral template and a civilizational memory, a reminder that the most enduring forces in our world do not always announce themselves with fanfare, might, or the trappings of power. I believe the younger generation needs to be reminded of this truth with great clarity. Modern society is often enchanted by the gargantuan, the loud, and the immediate. We are drawn to those who wield instant power or possess a shimmering outward veneer. However, history has proven time and again that the most sustainable and eternally valuable things are born from the simplest of beginnings. A newborn placed in a manger amidst the bitter cold is more than just a poignant, sacred image. It is a stern reminder that human dignity and the true worth of a life do not depend on the grandeur of one's circumstances, nor on status or material wealth. There are values that take a lifetime to fully grasp and appreciate. There are things the world ignores or dismisses at their inception, which ultimately and quietly go on to change the world, altering the very course of history. Perhaps this is why the story of that night in Bethlehem retains such a powerful resonance 2,000 years later. It is not because it is distant or ethereal, but because it is profoundly real and close to home. It touches upon the physical and spiritual exhaustion we all face. It mirrors the cramped conditions, the scarcity, and the insecurity that are part of the human lot. It speaks to families struggling to survive within a system far larger than themselves, a machine they cannot hope to dismantle. Yet, it was precisely there, in such harsh and seemingly hopeless circumstances, that hope began to flicker. It was unannounced and unobserved by the masses, known only to a few. Yet it was potent enough that 2 millennia later, humanity still looks back at that night. We still find ourselves wondering how a tiny town on a limestone ridge could leave such an indelible mark on the collective human consciousness. Bethlehem does not teach us how to conquer the world through force or political dominance. Instead, it invites us to pause and reflect on what is truly worth preserving and cherishing. The more I dwell on that night, the more I am convinced that the greatest lesson lies not in the imperial decrees that forced a census, nor in cold administrative orders, but in the reality that amidst the cold, the crowds, and the weariness of an ordinary night, history can unexpectedly turn a page toward a brighter, more meaningful chapter. Ultimately, the most profound value of this story lies not in the distant past, but in our present lives. As we age, we come to understand that life does not always unfold through glorious victories or grand events. Often, the most pivotal and destiny-shaping moments begin during periods of struggle in a house of scarcity, or during a cold season of illness, loss, loneliness, or those days when we feel there is nothing left to hope for. In this sense, the Bethlehem story is more than a symbolic religious event. It is a deeply human comfort. It is a sincere embrace for anyone who has ever felt small, forgotten, or pushed by life into circumstances not of their choosing. If the grand narrative of history could pivot from a narrow cave and such a lowly beginning, then perhaps none of us should be quick to despair over our own lives, no matter how arduous the current path may be. I think often of the elderly when I hear this story, for they understand better than anyone what it means to endure the difficult seasons of life. They have tasted the bitterness of toil and the weight of responsibility. They know the cost of keeping a home stable amidst the storms of existence. They understand that what keeps a person standing is not money or power, but an ironclad faith, an unshakable integrity, and a kindness that has been refined by fire. Bethlehem speaks to these core human values. It reminds us that true nobility does not require an audience. There are those who live, endure, and sacrifice in silence, and it is they who serve as the solid foundation, keeping family and society from fracturing. My personal view is this: the louder and more chaotic the modern world becomes, the more we need stories that compel us to slow down and look beneath the surface. We live in an age captivated by speed, social media prominence, and the pressure to prove our worth through grand gestures. Bethlehem offers the opposite path. It suggests that what saves us, what brings profound meaning to our existence, often starts with humility, faithfulness, and the capacity to endure without losing our humanity or our hope. This is a lesson every generation must learn anew, especially those growing up in a world of material abundance that is so often spiritually hollow. I also believe we should not view this as a mere ancient legend, but as something that vibrates within the very breath of our daily lives. We are still living amongst new empires, perhaps not the military might of Rome, but vast, invisible systems of power, digital empires that manipulate information, global corporations that shape economies, and invisible social pressures that keep us on a relentless treadmill. All of these can make an individual feel insignificant, adrift in a current far beyond their control. Within this vortex, we still grapple with the burden of sustenance, sudden illness, and the daily deluge of negative news. We harbor fears of aging in isolation and witness the fracturing of family ties. Yet, it is in this very context that Bethlehem becomes most vivid. It steps into the darkest corners of modern life and whispers an eternal message. Even in the most cramped, cold, and exhausted spaces, even when every door seems bolted shut, a spark of hope can still ignite, and a new beginning can still be born. If there is one spiritual value I wish to impart, it is a reverence for small beginnings. Think of a kind, sincere word spoken to a loved one that heals a long-festering wound. Think of the moment you choose forgiveness over bitterness, even when your heart aches. Consider a steady faith that refuses to yield in times of crisis, or a small flame that keeps burning when everything else has been extinguished. A home may be humble and simple, yet if it is filled with love, it becomes the only true sanctuary against the storms of life. A heart may grow old, but if it remains expansive and understanding rather than cynical, it possesses a greatness beyond measure. To a world obsessed with the flashy and the formidable, these things seem trivial. Yet, these seemingly insignificant choices are often the keys to the deepest part of our journey. Human history once changed direction on a quiet, humble night in Bethlehem. Therefore, none of us has the right to overlook the small acts of goodness or the fragile seeds of hope in our own lives. Sometimes, the most monumental shifts are nurtured in the smallest of places. This is why we must listen to this story again and again. For the more we listen, the more we stop seeing merely a cold winter night in ancient Judea and start seeing our own lives, our struggles, our anxieties, and our moments of vulnerability reflected back at us. We see the winters we have traversed and the dead ends we have faced. We see the times we were too exhausted to continue, yet found the strength to take another step because life demanded it. We see the moments we felt too small to make a difference in this vast world. And then, a sudden realization breaks through. True greatness is not about being celebrated by the world. It is about keeping the light of hope and love alive within the life we are given, however humble it may be. If this timeless narrative has touched you, do not let it be a fleeting emotion. Hold on to something enduring. Take a moment of silence to reflect on the core values you wish to nurture, the people you need to love more fully, and the spiritual legacy you wish to leave behind before time slips away. And if you believe that today's generation, growing up in such a turbulent world, still needs these stories to find their moral compass, then do not hesitate. Share this reflection with a friend who is lost, a loved one who is struggling, or anyone who needs to be reminded that even in the darkest, coldest night, hope can still take root, and the eternal light is always waiting to break through.